bound by 2 kingdoms. Branded by her father's sins, Lady Beatrice of Montwick had spent years locked away, forgotten by the world. But when Sir Hugh of Ravensshire appeared at her door, his expression unreadable, she knew her fate had changed. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You should hate me," he murmured. "So why did you call for me?" Chapter 1. The Walls of Silence. The stone was always cold. No matter the season, the chill seeped into Beatrice's bones, a constant reminder of her isolation. The walls of the West Tower of Montwick Castle had been her world for 15 years, ever since her father, Lord Edmund, had been branded a traitor and executed for conspiring against King Edward. She had been 10 then, a child ripped from the bustling life of the court, from silks and laughter, to this silent, gray existence. The tapestries on the walls, once vibrant depictions of hunts and feasts, were now faded and moth-eaten, mirroring the slow decay of her own hopes. Sunlight filtered through the narrow, arched window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. It was the only movement she saw most days, save for the occasional scuttling of a mouse or the silent glide of a spider spinning its web in the corner. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed covered with a threadbare woolen blanket, a small, scarred wooden table, a single stool, and a chest containing the few meager possessions she still owned. A chipped porcelain doll, a relic from her childhood, lay nestled amongst the worn linen shifts, and a single, faded blue gown, a haunting reminder of a life she could barely remember. Beatrice traced the outline of the doll's painted smile, a bitter ache in her chest. She had named her Eleanor, after the Queen, a childish fancy long since turned to dust. She wondered if Eleanor, the real Eleanor, even remembered her. Probably not. Kings and queens had little time for the daughters of traitors. A raven's harsh caw echoed from outside, breaking the silence. Beatrice rose, her joints stiff from years of confinement, and moved to the window. She could see the courtyard below, a patchwork of gray stone and green grass, where the daily life of the castle continued without her. Servants scurried about, carrying water and firewood. Stable boys tended to the horses, and occasionally a knight would stride across the yard, his armor gleaming in the sun. She watched them, a silent observer, a ghost in her own home. The memory of her father was a fractured thing, a mosaic of warmth and fear. She remembered his booming laugh, the way he'd toss her in the air, the scent of leather and horses that always clung to him. But she also remembered the hushed whispers, the hurried meetings in the dead of night, the fear that had crept into his eyes in the weeks before his arrest. She had never understood the politics, the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that had led to his downfall. All she knew was that one day he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving her branded with his shame. Her mother, Lady Annalise, had died of a broken heart, they said, a few months after Edmund's execution. Beatrice barely remembered her, a pale, fragile woman with sad eyes and a gentle touch. She had faded away like a whisper in the wind, leaving Beatrice utterly alone. The only person who had shown her any kindness in those early years was old Meg, the castle's herb woman. Meg would sneak her small treats, a honey cake, a sprig of lavender, a smooth, gray stone found by the river. She would tell Beatrice stories of the forest, of the creatures that lived amongst the trees, of the magic that still whispered in the ancient woods. Meg had taught her about herbs, about their healing properties, about the secrets hidden within the leaves and roots. It was a meager education, but it was all Beatrice had. Meg had died 5 years ago, leaving another gaping hole in Beatrice's already desolate world. Now, her only visitor was Alara, a young serving girl, who brought her meals and fresh water. Alara was timid and wary, clearly afraid of the traitor's daughter, but she was also kind, in her own hesitant way. She would sometimes linger for a few moments, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, before hurrying away, the clatter of her wooden shoes echoing down the stone stairs. Beatrice sighed, turning away from the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a beautiful sight, but it brought her no joy. beauty was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her days were measured by the changing light, by the tolling of the castle bell, by the slow, steady beat of her own lonely heart. She had learned to live with the silence, with the emptiness, with the constant ache of what had been lost. She had learned to be invisible, a shadow in the forgotten corner of a once great house. She knelt by her bed, her hands clasped tightly together. Her prayers were simple, whispered pleas for peace, for an end to the endless solitude. She didn't pray for rescue, for a return to the life she had lost. She knew that was impossible. The stain of her father's treason was indelible, a mark that would follow her to her grave. All she could hope for was a quiet ending, a release from the cold, silent prison of her life. Suddenly, a sharp rap on the heavy oak door shattered the stillness. Beatrice's heart leaped into her throat. No one ever knocked. Alara always simply pushed the door open, her arrival heralded by the creak of the hinges. This was different. This was deliberate. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Had they finally come for her? After all these years, had the king remembered her existence? Was she to be dragged from her tower and executed for her father's sins? Or was it something worse? The uncertainty was a torment, a twisting knife in her gut. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest, her eyes fixed on the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was a demand, not a request. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to move. Her legs felt heavy, as if weighted down by chains. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the iron latch. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the cold metal. What awaited her on the other side? Was it death? Was it something even more terrifying? She closed her eyes, a silent prayer escaping her lips. Then, with a surge of desperate courage, she pulled the latch open. The door swung inward, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the leather and chain-mail of a knight. His face was in shadow, his features obscured, but she could sense the power that emanated from him, the aura of authority that surrounded him like a cloak. He stood there for a long moment, his silence more intimidating than any shout. Then, he stepped into the room, and Beatrice finally saw his face. It was a face that would haunt her dreams, a face that would change her life forever. And his first words to her dripped with an icy knowing that sent shivers down to her very core. Chapter 2. A Knight's Summons. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, a piercing gray that seemed to see straight through her, to the very core of her fear and loneliness. They were not cruel eyes, but they held a weariness, a hint of sadness that resonated with something deep within her own soul. His face was strong, angular, with a jawline that spoke of determination and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. A scar, thin and white, bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to battles fought and survived. He was not young, perhaps in his late 30s, but age had only added to his formidable presence. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to command, to obedience. He was Sir Hugh of Ravensshire, a name she vaguely recognized from the whispers that had reached even her isolated tower. A knight of renowned valor, a loyal servant of the king, a man known for his unwavering sense of duty and his unflinching adherence to the law. A man who, by all rights, should despise her. Lady Beatrice of Montwick, he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the small room. It was not a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement of her existence, of her identity. It was the first time in 15 years that anyone had addressed her by her full title, and the sound of it sent a shiver of unease through her. Beatrice curtsied, a reflex ingrained from her childhood training. It felt awkward, clumsy, after so many years of disuse. "Sir Knight," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her eyes downcast, unable to meet his penetrating gaze. He studied her for a long moment, his silence stretching out, thick with unspoken questions and judgments. She could feel his scrutiny, like a physical weight pressing down on her. She wished she could disappear, to melt into the stone walls and become invisible once more. "You are smaller than I expected," he said finally, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion. "And paler. The years have not been kind to you, Lady Beatrice." It was a statement of fact, not a condemnation. But it still stung. She knew she was a shadow of her former self, her beauty faded, her spirit broken. She had seen her reflection in the small, cracked mirror that Alara had brought her, a thin, pale face with haunted eyes and hair that had lost its youthful luster. "They have been long years, Sir Knight," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, as if acknowledging a truth he already knew. "I have been sent by the king," he said, his words dropping like stones into the silence. Beatrice's heart clenched. This was it, then. The summons she had both dreaded and secretly longed for. An end, one way or another, to her long confinement. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. "He requires your presence at court," Sir Hugh continued, his voice unwavering. Beatrice's eyes snapped open. "At court? Why?" After all these years, why would the king suddenly summon her? It made no sense. She was a non-entity, a forgotten relic of a past betrayal. I do not understand," she stammered, her mind reeling. Sir Hugh stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the scent of leather and steel, the faint aroma of wood smoke clinging to his clothes. It was a scent that spoke of the outside world, of a life she had long since been denied. "The king has need of you, Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice softening slightly, though his gaze remained intense. "There are matters that require your attention, matters that concern your family, your inheritance, and your future." Her inheritance? What inheritance? Montwick Castle was hers in name only. She had no power, no influence, no say in its affairs. The king had appointed a steward to oversee the estate, a man she had never met. Her future? She had no future, only a past that stained her present, and a present that stretched endlessly, bleakly before her. "I have nothing to offer the king," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and despair. "My father was a traitor. I am nothing." Sir Hugh's expression remained unreadable. "The king believes otherwise," he said. "He believes you may be of service to him." Service? What service could she possibly provide? She was a woman, and a disgraced one at that. She had no skills, no knowledge of courtly intrigue, no understanding of the political machinations that had destroyed her father. "I am to be a pawn, then?" she asked, a flicker of defiance sparking within her. It was a small spark, almost extinguished by years of resignation, but it was there. Sir Hugh did not answer immediately. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching, probing. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but even pawns can have value, Lady Beatrice. Even pawns can influence the game." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She sensed a hidden agenda, a secret purpose behind the king's summons. But what was it? And what role was she expected to play? "I've been given orders to escort you to court," Sir Hugh continued, his voice firm. "We leave at dawn." Dawn. It was only a few hours away. She had so little time to prepare, to gather her meager belongings, to brace herself for whatever awaited her. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate desire to cling to the familiar walls of her tower, to the safety of her isolation. But she knew she had no choice. She was a prisoner of her past, and now she was a prisoner of the king's will. She looked at Sir Hugh, his face a mask of stoic duty. She saw no sympathy there, no understanding of her fear. He was simply a soldier, following orders. But there was something else, too, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a hint of respect? "You should hate me," he murmured unexpectedly, the soft rumble of his voice breaking the rising tension. His words hung in the air, a perplexing riddle. Beatrice met his gaze, a question in her own. He had no reason to like her. "So, why did you call for me?" she whispered back, confused by the intensity of his stare, the unexpected turn of his words. The question was more than just about the summons, it was about the look in his eyes, the unreadable depths that held both challenge and a strange, unsettling acknowledgement. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Name. His gaze held hers, the gray depths unyielding, and for a fleeting moment, Beatrice thought she saw a flicker of something akin to pain cross his features. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined it. Because, he said, his voice low and rough, the king believes you are innocent. And because he paused, his jaw tightening, as if he were wrestling with some inner turmoil. Because I owe your father a debt. The word struck her like a physical blow. A debt? To her father? The traitor? It was preposterous. Sir Hugh of Ravensshire, a knight renowned for his loyalty to the crown, owed a debt to the man who had betrayed that very crown? I do not understand, she stammered, her mind struggling to reconcile this impossible revelation with everything she had ever believed. He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. It is a long story, Lady Beatrice, he said, and one that is not easily told. Suffice it to say that your father saved my life, many years ago, before the events that led to his downfall. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle on the table, as if the past held a painful grip on him. Beatrice watched him, her confusion growing. She had never heard this story. Her father had never spoken of Sir Hugh, of any debt owed. It was as if a hidden chapter of her father's life had suddenly been revealed, a chapter that cast his actions in a completely new light. What happened? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of the sword that hung at his side. It was a gesture of unconscious habit, the reflex of a warrior accustomed to facing danger. We were ambushed, he said finally, his voice tight with the memory. Outnumbered, surrounded. I was young, inexperienced, and foolish. I would have died that day, if not for your father. He took an arrow meant for me. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had never known this. She had always imagined her father as a cold, calculating conspirator, driven by ambition and a thirst for power. But this painted a picture of a man of courage, of loyalty, of self-sacrifice. He saved your life, she repeated, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Sir Hugh nodded, his gaze meeting hers once more. He did, he said, and I have never forgotten it. I swore an oath, that day, to repay that debt, to protect his family, if ever the opportunity arose. The opportunity. So that was it. The king's summons was not just a whim, a political maneuver. It was a chance for Sir Hugh to fulfill his oath, to redeem a debt of honor. But why now, after all these years? What had changed? Why now? She asked, voicing her thoughts aloud. He hesitated again, his expression guarded. The king has his reasons, he said, and they are not mine to reveal. But I believe he intends to restore your family's honor. To clear your father's name. Beatrice's heart leaped with a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the darkness of her despair. To clear her father's name? To be free of the stain of treason? It was almost too much to hope for. But how? She asked, her voice trembling. My father is dead. The evidence against him was overwhelming. She remembered the hushed whispers, the accusations, the trial that had been a mere formality, a predetermined condemnation. Her father had confessed to his crimes, had begged for mercy, but the king had been unyielding. The king believes there was another involved, Sir Hugh said, his voice low and cautious. Someone who escaped justice. Someone who may still be plotting against the crown. Another involved? A hidden conspirator? Beatrice's mind raced. Who could it be? And what role did the king expect her to play in uncovering this hidden truth? He believes I can help? She asked, incredulity lacing her voice. But I know nothing of these things. I was a child. You may know more than you realize, Lady Beatrice, Sir Hugh said. Memories, whispers, fragments of conversations the king believes you may hold the key to unlocking the truth. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. She could feel the warmth of his body, the intensity of his gaze. It was unnerving, yet strangely comforting. I will protect you, Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice firm and reassuring. I will see you safely to court, and I will stand by you, whatever may come. That is my oath." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a wave of warmth through her, melting some of the ice that had encased her heart for so long. She looked at him, at the strength in his face, at the unwavering determination in his eyes. And for the first time in 15 years, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. She felt hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. It could be crushed, shattered, leaving her even more vulnerable than before. She had learned that lesson well. Yet, she couldn't deny the small, fragile seed of hope that had been planted within her, nurtured by Sir Hugh's words, by his promise of protection. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. She didn't know what awaited her at court, what dangers and challenges she would face. But she knew one thing. She was no longer alone. She had Sir Hugh of Ravensshire, a knight bound by honor and a debt of the past, to guide her, to protect her, and perhaps, just perhaps, to help her find a way to reclaim her life, her name, and her future. A weight was lifted, and also pressed down upon her the double-edged truth of her father's past and her uncertain future. The journey would be long, and the path ahead shrouded in mist, but for the first time, she felt a tremor of purpose, a flicker of life within the long-dormant walls of her heart. The dawn would bring a new world, and she would face it, not as a ghost, but as the daughter of a man who, whatever his sins, had also been brave. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Stone. The journey to the king's court was a blur of changing landscapes and fleeting encounters. They rode hard, stopping only for brief rests and hurried meals at roadside inns. Beatrice, accustomed to the silence and stillness of her tower, found the constant movement and the unfamiliar sights and sounds both exhilarating and overwhelming. The world outside Montwick was a vibrant tapestry of life, a stark contrast to the gray monotony of her confinement. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. Bustling villages teemed with merchants and craftsmen, their voices a cacophony of bartering and gossip. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, of horses and freshly turned earth. It was a sensory overload, a feast for eyes and ears long starved of stimulation. Sir Hugh was a silent and watchful companion. He rarely spoke, except to give necessary instructions or to answer her occasional questions. He seemed to inhabit a world of his own, a world of duty and responsibility, where personal feelings were a luxury he could not afford. Yet, she sensed a quiet protectiveness in his actions, in the way he always positioned himself between her and any potential danger, in the way he ensured she had enough to eat and drink, in the way he would occasionally glance at her, his gray eyes softening with a hint of concern. She tried to engage him in conversation, to learn more about him, about his life, about the debt he owed her father. But he remained guarded, revealing little of himself. He spoke of his loyalty to the king, of his years of service in the royal army, of the battles he had fought. But he never spoke of his personal life, of his family, of his hopes or dreams. He was an enigma, a man of steel and silence, whose heart remained a closed book. Beatrice, in turn, found herself strangely drawn to him. It was not a romantic attraction, not yet, but a sense of gratitude, of respect, and a growing awareness of the complex and honorable man beneath the stoic exterior. She was fascinated by his strength, by his unwavering sense of duty, by the quiet sadness that sometimes flickered in his eyes. She longed to understand him, to break through the walls he had erected around himself, to discover the man beneath the armor. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire in a small, secluded clearing, Beatrice dared to broach the subject of her father again. "Sir Hugh," she said, her voice hesitant, "you said my father saved your life. Can you tell me more about that day?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "It was during the border wars," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "We were on patrol, a small company of knights, scouting for enemy movements. We were ambushed by a much larger force of Welsh rebels. They came out of nowhere, like shadows in the mist. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the flames, as if reliving the memory. Beatrice watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. We were outnumbered, surrounded, he continued. We fought bravely, but it was a losing battle. I was unhorsed, my sword knocked from my hand. I fell to the ground, dazed and disoriented. I saw a Welsh warrior raise his sword, ready to strike the killing blow. He closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with the horror of that moment. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. And then, he said, his voice barely a whisper, your father appeared. He rode between me and the warrior, intercepting the blow. The sword struck him in the shoulder, piercing his armor. He cried out in pain, but he held his ground. He gave me the time I needed to recover, to get back on my feet, to rejoin the fight. Beatrice listened, her breath caught in her throat. She could almost see the scene, the chaos of battle, the clash of steel, the courage of her father. We eventually drove off the rebels, Sir Hugh continued. But your father was badly wounded. He lost a lot of blood. We feared he would not survive. But he did, Beatrice said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and pride. Sir Hugh nodded. He did. He was a strong man, your father. A brave man. And a loyal friend. A loyal friend. The words echoed in Beatrice's mind. It was a side of her father she had never known, a side that had been hidden from her by the accusations of treason. Why did he betray the king? She asked, the question she had been wrestling with for 15 years finally escaping her lips. Sir Hugh looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. I do not know, Lady Beatrice, he said. I have asked myself that question many times. I have searched for answers, but I have found none. Perhaps he was driven by ambition. Perhaps he was misled by others. Perhaps he had a reason we do not know. He paused, looking deep into the flames as shadows flickered across his features. I do know, he added slowly, that he regretted his actions at the end. I know he wished for forgiveness, for second chance. He did love you. More than life. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The weight of them, the weight of history, of her father's actions pressed upon her. It was growing late, and the embers burned low. The night stood. We have to be ready to ride at dawn, he said. His tone a gentle dismissal. Beatrice nodded, her mind reeling with this new information, with the conflicting images of her father. She was no closer to understanding the truth, but she had gained a new perspective, a new appreciation for the complexities of his character. As she lay down to sleep, wrapped in her cloak, beneath the vast, star-studded sky, she listened to the whispers of the wind in the trees. They seemed to carry the echoes of the past, the secrets of her family, the mysteries that awaited her at court. The stones of Montwick had held their secrets close. But, maybe, the stones of the king's castle would whisper a different tale. And, maybe there, she will finally understand. Chapter 5. The Serpent's Bargain. The king's court was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and power. The castle, a sprawling fortress of gray stone, perched high on a cliff overlooking a vast, shimmering lake. Banners bearing the royal crest, a golden lion on a field of crimson, fluttered from every tower. Courtiers, dressed in silks and velvets of every imaginable hue, thronged the halls, their voices a constant hum of conversation and laughter. Musicians played lively tunes on lutes and harps, while jugglers and acrobats entertained the crowds. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and spices, of roasted meats and fine wine. Beatrice, accustomed to the quiet solitude of her tower, felt overwhelmed by the sheer opulence and the constant press of people. She clung to Sir Hugh's side, her hand gripping his arm as he led her through the crowded corridors. She felt like a peasant, a country bumpkin, lost in a world of glittering sophistication. Her simple woolen gown, the only one she owned that wasn't threadbare, felt drab and out of place amidst the finery of the court. She drew stares, whispers, and curious glances. Some were openly hostile, recognizing her as the daughter of the infamous traitor. Others were simply curious, intrigued by the mysterious woman who had suddenly appeared at court after years of seclusion. Beatrice kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Sir Hugh, however, seemed unfazed by the attention. He moved through the crowd with an air of quiet authority, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his gray eyes scanning the faces around them. He was a respected figure at court, a knight of renowned valor, and his presence seemed to command a certain deference. They were eventually ushered into a large, richly decorated antechamber, where they were told to wait. The room was filled with tapestries depicting scenes of royal triumphs, and the furniture was crafted from dark, polished wood. A large fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire crackling within, providing a welcome warmth against the chill of the stone walls. Beatrice sat on a small, uncomfortable stool, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had no idea what to expect, what the king wanted from her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a piece on a chessboard she couldn't even see. After what seemed like an eternity, a door at the far end of the room opened, and a tall, imposing figure emerged. It was King Edward himself. He was older than Beatrice remembered, his hair now streaked with silver, his face lined with the cares of ruling a kingdom. But his eyes still held the same sharp intelligence, the same unwavering authority. He wore a robe of crimson velvet, embroidered with gold thread, and a heavy gold chain bearing the royal seal hung around his neck. He surveyed Beatrice with a cool, assessing gaze, his expression unreadable. She curtsied deeply, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lady Beatrice of Montwick," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "You have been summoned." It was the same phrase Sir Hugh had used, but coming from the king, it carried a far greater weight, a sense of finality. "Your Majesty," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The king gestured to a chair opposite his own. "Sit," he commanded. Beatrice obeyed, her legs trembling slightly. She sat stiffly, her back straight, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap. The king studied her for a long moment, his silence stretching out, thick with unspoken questions and judgments. She could feel his scrutiny, like a physical weight pressing down on her. "You resemble your mother," he said finally, his voice softening slightly. "She was a beautiful woman, Lady Annalise, and a loyal subject." The mention of her mother brought a pang of sadness to Beatrice's heart. She barely remembered her, a pale, fragile figure who had faded away like a whisper in the wind. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. The king nodded, as if acknowledging her grief. "Your father," he said, his voice hardening again, "was a different matter. He betrayed me. He betrayed his country. He betrayed his oath." Beatrice flinched at the harsh words. She had heard them many times before, but they still stung, still carried the weight of her family's shame. "I know, Your Majesty," she stammered. "But I believe," the king continued, his voice low and intense, "that you are innocent, that you had no knowledge of your father's treachery." Beatrice's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. Was it possible? Could the king truly believe in her innocence? "I was a child, Your Majesty," she said. "I knew nothing of politics, of conspiracies." The king nodded. "So I have been told," he said. "But you may know more than you realize. Memories, whispers, fragments of conversations, you may hold the key to unlocking the truth." He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "I believe there was another involved in your father's plot," he said. "Someone who escaped justice. Someone who is still out there, plotting against me." Beatrice's mind raced. She had heard this from Sir Hugh, but to hear it from the king himself, to see the conviction in his eyes, made it all the more real, all the more terrifying. I do not know who that could be, Your Majesty," she said. The king smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"Perhaps not," he said.
"But I believe you can help me find them. I believe you can help me uncover the truth." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I am offering you a bargain, Lady Beatrice," he said. "A chance to redeem your family's honor, to clear your father's name, to reclaim your inheritance. It was the offer she had dreamed of, the impossible hope that had flickered within her. But she knew there would be a price. There was always a price. And what would he require in return, Your Majesty? She asked, her voice trembling. The king's smile widened. Your loyalty, he said. Your obedience. And your cooperation. He emphasized the last word with slow deliberation. He rose from his chair and walked towards her, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the scent of his perfume, a heavy, musky scent that spoke of power and wealth. Lord Astley believes you might have information. He continued, the name a punch to the gut. Lord Astley, the king's closest advisor, he was a shrewd, manipulative man. A man who had grown rich by serving the king and twisting those around him. I will give you access to your father's papers, the king said, to the castle archives. You will search for any clues, any hints, any names that might lead us to the truth. A serpent's bargain indeed. And as the king's gaze turned cold, she understood she would have to do what the king asked or suffer the consequences. Chapter 6. Echoes of Treachery. The castle archives were a vast, labyrinthine collection of documents, scrolls, and ledgers, accumulated over centuries of Montwick history. They were housed in a series of dusty, dimly lit chambers beneath the main castle, accessible only by a winding stone staircase and a heavy, iron-bound door. The air was cold and damp, and the scent of aged parchment and mildew hung heavy in the air. Beatrice, armed with a flickering oil lamp and a list of names provided by Lord Astley, felt a sense of both excitement and trepidation as she began her search. She had spent her life surrounded by the silence of her tower, yearning for knowledge, for a connection to the world outside. Now, she was immersed in the very heart of her family's history, surrounded by the echoes of generations past. But it was also a daunting task. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, and the documents were written in a mixture of Latin and archaic English, often in a cramped, difficult-to-decipher script. She had learned some Latin from Old Meg, but it was hardly enough to navigate the complexities of legal documents and courtly correspondence. Sir Hugh, at the king's command, was assigned to assist her. He was not a scholar, but he was literate, and his knowledge of military matters and courtly affairs proved invaluable. He would sit patiently by her side, his presence a silent reassurance in the otherwise desolate chambers, helping her decipher the more difficult passages, offering his insights into the political landscape of her father's time. They worked in silence for the most part, the only sounds the rustle of parchment, the scratch of Beatrice's quill as she made notes, and the occasional sigh or muttered exclamation from Sir Hugh. But despite the lack of conversation, a sense of companionship began to develop between them. They were united in a common purpose, a shared quest for the truth, and that forged a bond that transcended their vastly different backgrounds. Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to Sir Hugh's quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, his deep-seated sense of honor. She would catch herself watching him, admiring the way the lamplight played on his strong features, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his hands, so skilled with a sword, moved with surprising gentleness over the fragile documents. She also began to see glimpses of the man beneath the stoic exterior. She noticed the way his eyes would soften when he spoke of his former comrades in arms, the way a hint of sadness would flicker across his face when he mentioned his family estate, which he had rarely visited since joining the king's service. She learned that he had lost his younger brother in the same border wars where her father had saved his life, a loss that had clearly left a deep scar on his soul. One evening, as they were poring over a particularly dense collection of letters written by her father to various nobles, Beatrice stumbled upon a passage that made her heart skip a beat. "Hugh," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "look at this." He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers, sending a shiver of awareness through her. She pointed to a sentence in the letter, written in a hurried, almost frantic script. It says, "I fear Astley's influence over the king. He is a serpent in the garden, whispering poison in his ear." Sir Hugh's eyes widened. He read the passage again, his lips moving silently. "Astley," he muttered. "Your father suspected him?" Beatrice nodded.
It seems so, she said. But why?
What could Astley have gained from my father's downfall? Sir Hugh frowned. Astley was a rising star in the court at that time, he said. Ambitious, ruthless. He was known to be jealous of your father's influence with the king. But to frame him for treason? Beatrice said. That seems extreme. Perhaps, Sir Hugh said. But Astley is a man who is capable of anything. He is a master of manipulation of intrigue. He has spies everywhere, even within the king's own household. The revelation sent a chill down Beatrice's spine. If Astley was indeed the hidden conspirator, then she was in grave danger. He would not hesitate to silence her if he believed she was getting close to the truth. We must be careful, Hugh, she said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. Astley cannot know what we are doing. He cannot suspect that we suspect him. Sir Hugh nodded, his expression grim. I agree, he said. We must be discreet. We must gather more evidence before we confront him, before we present our findings to the king. They continued their search, their focus now sharpened by the discovery of her father's suspicions. They found other hints, other subtle clues that seemed to point to Astley's involvement. A coded message intercepted by her father, a list of names that included several of Astley's known associates, a payment made to a shadowy figure who had been seen meeting with Astley shortly before her father's arrest. The evidence was circumstantial, not conclusive, but it was enough to convince Beatrice that her father had been right. Astley was the serpent in the garden, the traitor who had escaped justice. And now, she and Sir Hugh were on his trail, walking a dangerous path that could lead to either redemption or destruction. The echoes of treachery were growing louder, and the past and present tangled together around the name that she sought to both fear and uncover. As the days dwindled, they were drawing closer, with every rustle of parchment, to the very truth that may save them all, or consume them completely. Chapter 7. The Falcon and the Dove. Life at court was a constant performance, a carefully choreographed dance of power and intrigue. Beatrice, accustomed to the solitude of her tower, found it exhausting and bewildering. She had to learn the intricate rules of courtly etiquette, the subtle nuances of language and gesture, the unspoken hierarchies that governed every interaction. She was given chambers in the west wing of the castle, overlooking the gardens. They were small and sparsely furnished compared to the opulent suites of the other courtiers, but they were a palace compared to her tower room. She had a bed with a feather mattress, a chest for her clothes, a small table and chair, and a window that offered a breathtaking view of the lake and the surrounding countryside. Alara, the young serving girl from Montwick, had been brought to court to attend to her. Beatrice was grateful for her presence, for the familiar face in a sea of strangers. Alara was still timid and wary, but she was also fiercely loyal to Beatrice, and she provided a much-needed source of comfort and companionship. Beatrice was expected to attend the daily rituals of court life, the morning audience with the king, the midday meal in the great hall, the evening entertainments of music and dancing. She was introduced to the other courtiers, a dazzling array of nobles, knights, and ladies, all vying for the king's favor. She quickly learned that court was a dangerous place, a breeding ground for gossip, rumors, and betrayal. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for any weakness, any sign of vulnerability. She had to be careful what she said, who she trusted, who she offended. Lord Astley was a constant presence, his smooth, smiling face a mask that hid his true intentions. He was unfailingly polite to Beatrice, showering her with compliments and offering his assistance in her search for the truth. But she could sense the cold calculation in his eyes, the subtle threat that lay beneath his courteous demeanor. She knew he was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal her suspicions. She had to be careful, to play the role of the innocent, grieving daughter, seeking justice for her father, while secretly gathering evidence against him. Sir Hugh was her constant protector, her shield against the dangers of the court. He was always by her side, his presence a silent reassurance, his gray eyes watchful and alert. He guided her through the intricacies of courtly life, advising her on who to trust, who to avoid, how to navigate the treacherous currents of political intrigue. He also taught her how to defend herself. He showed her how to use a dagger, how to parry a blow, how to fight dirty if necessary. He knew that she was a target, that Astley would not hesitate to eliminate her if she became a threat. "You must be like a falcon, Lady Beatrice," he said, during one of their training sessions in a secluded courtyard. "Swift, silent, and deadly. You must be able to strike before your enemy even sees you coming." Beatrice, however, felt more like a dove, trapped in a cage of gilded bars. She was not a warrior, not a fighter. She was a scholar, a dreamer, a woman who longed for peace and quiet. But she knew she had to learn to fight, to defend herself, to survive. She practiced diligently, her movements initially clumsy and awkward, but gradually gaining in strength and confidence. Sir Hugh was a patient teacher, correcting her mistakes, praising her progress, pushing her to be her best. She also began to observe the other courtiers, studying their interactions, their alliances, their rivalries. She learned to read the subtle signs of deception, the hidden agendas, the unspoken threats. She discovered that court was a web of secrets, where nothing was as it seemed, where everyone had something to hide. She found an unlikely ally in Lady Eleanor, a distant cousin of the king, a woman known for her sharp wit and her independent spirit. Lady Eleanor was older than Beatrice, perhaps in her late 40s, but she possessed a youthful energy and a keen intelligence. She had seen through Astley's facade long ago, and she was one of the few people at court who dared to speak openly against him. "He is a viper, my dear," Lady Eleanor said, during one of their afternoon walks in the gardens. "He has poisoned the king's mind, turned him against his own friends and allies. He is a danger to the realm." Lady Eleanor became Beatrice's confidant, her advisor, her friend. She helped her navigate the treacherous waters of court life, offering her insights into the personalities and motivations of the other courtiers. She also shared with Beatrice her own suspicions about Astley, her belief that he was involved in a much larger conspiracy, one that threatened the very stability of the kingdom. Beatrice, with Sir Hugh's protection and Lady Eleanor's guidance, began to find her footing at court. She was still a dove, vulnerable and exposed, but she was learning to fly, to use her intelligence, her intuition, her knowledge of the past, to protect herself and to uncover the truth. She was becoming a falcon, in her own way, and one crisp evening, she stood by her window, looking to the sky, knowing very well that she had to master flying in order to strike when the time was right. The falcon and dove co-existed the battle and the strategy, and she needed both to survive. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Beatrice's search through the archives continued, yielding a slow but steady stream of evidence against Astley. She and Sir Hugh worked tirelessly, poring over ancient documents, deciphering coded messages, piecing together the fragments of a conspiracy that had spanned years. They discovered that Astley had been systematically manipulating the king, feeding him false information, turning him against his most loyal advisors, including Beatrice's father. He had used his position of influence to enrich himself, to amass power and wealth, to build a network of spies and informants that extended throughout the kingdom. They also found evidence that Astley had been in contact with the king's enemies, with foreign powers who sought to destabilize the realm and overthrow the monarchy. He had been selling state secrets, providing them with military intelligence, plotting with them to assassinate the king and seize the throne for themselves. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous their situation became. Astley was aware of their investigation, and he was taking steps to counter their efforts. He had his spies follow them, monitor their conversations, intercept their messages. He was trying to discredit them, to turn the king against them, to paint them as the traitors, not him. Beatrice and Sir Hugh had to be ever more cautious, more discreet. They met in secret, in hidden corners of the castle, in the dead of night, communicating through coded messages, trusting no one but each other. Their relationship deepened, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual trust. They were no longer just knight and lady, investigator and subject. They were comrades, partners, friends. They relied on each other, protected each other, supported each other. Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to Sir Hugh's strength, his unwavering loyalty, his quiet compassion. She admired his courage, his integrity, his dedication to justice. She saw the pain in his eyes, the scars of his past, the burden of responsibility he carried. She also began to see a different side of him, a softer side, a side that he rarely revealed to anyone. She saw his gentleness with Alara, his kindness to the castle servants, his respect for the common folk. She saw his love for his family estate, his longing for a life beyond the constant demands of court and duty. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire in Beatrice's chambers, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese, Sir Hugh began to talk about his past. He spoke of his childhood, of his family, of his early years as a squire, training to be a knight. He told her about his younger brother, Thomas, who had been his closest companion, his confidant, his best friend. He described their adventures together, their shared dreams, their unwavering loyalty to each other. And then he spoke of Thomas's death, his voice raw with grief, his eyes filled with a pain that time had not erased. "He was killed in the same ambush where your father saved my life," he said. "He was only 16. He was everything I was not. Brave, cheerful, optimistic. He had a gift for making people laugh, for bringing joy into their lives." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, as if lost in the memory of his lost brother. Beatrice watched him, her heart aching for his pain. "I blamed myself," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I was the older brother. I was supposed to protect him. I should have been the one to die." Beatrice reached out and touched his hand, her fingers gently clasping his. It was the first time they had touched so intimately, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. "It was not your fault, Hugh," she said softly. "It was war. There was nothing you could have done." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Perhaps," he said, "but I have lived with that guilt for many years. It has shaped me, made me who I am." He turned his hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His grip was strong, reassuring, yet gentle. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of connection, of intimacy that she had never experienced before. "I see the scars, Hugh," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I also see the strength, the courage, the kindness. You are a good man. A noble man." He smiled, a rare, fleeting smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "And you, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "You are a survivor. A fighter. A woman of extraordinary courage and resilience." They sat there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze that spoke volumes. The air between them crackled with unspoken feelings, with a growing awareness of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that was more than just friendship, more than just comradeship. It was something deeper, something stronger, something that was beginning to feel like love. But they both knew that love was a luxury they could not afford, not yet. They were in the midst of a dangerous game, a battle against a powerful enemy. They had to focus on their mission, on their quest for justice, on their survival. Yet, the seed of love had been planted, and it was beginning to grow, slowly but surely, nurtured by their shared experiences, their mutual respect, their growing affection for each other. It was a fragile flower, blooming in the midst of a battlefield, but it was there, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a promise of a future that might, one day, be theirs. The scars of the past made the present more intense. And the future was a question that was not quite ready to be asked. But it loomed, a hopeful shimmer on a dangerous horizon. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Trust. The king summoned Beatrice and Sir Hugh to a private audience. He had reviewed their findings, the evidence they had gathered against Astley, and he was impressed. "You have done well, Lady Beatrice, Sir Hugh," he said, his voice grave. "You have uncovered a conspiracy that threatens the very foundations of my realm." He paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. Beatrice and Sir Hugh stood before him, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had risked their lives to gather this evidence, and now, everything hinged on the king's decision. The evidence is compelling, the king continued. But it is not conclusive. Astley is a powerful man with many allies. I cannot simply arrest him without irrefutable proof. I need something more, something that will convince the court, the nobles, the people, that he is a traitor. Beatrice and Sir Hugh exchanged a look. They knew what the king was asking. He wanted them to find the smoking gun, the undeniable evidence that would seal Astley's fate. We understand, Your Majesty, Sir Hugh said. We will continue our investigation. We will find the proof you need. The king nodded. I trust you, Sir Hugh, he said. I have always trusted you. You have served me faithfully for many years. You have never wavered in your loyalty. He turned to Beatrice, his gaze softening slightly. And you, Lady Beatrice, he said. You have shown remarkable courage and determination. You have proven yourself to be a worthy daughter of your father, despite his sins. The words were a double-edged sword, a compliment tinged with a reminder of her family's shame. But Beatrice accepted them with grace, her head held high. I am grateful for your trust, Your Majesty, she said. I will not betray it. The king smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. I believe you, he said. I believe you are both driven by a desire for justice, by a love for your kingdom. He paused, his gaze turning serious once more. But be warned, he said. Astley is a dangerous man. He will not hesitate to kill you if he believes you are a threat. Be careful. Trust no one but each other. His words were a chilling reminder of the stakes they were playing for. They were not just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their lives. As they left the king's chambers, Beatrice felt a renewed sense of determination. She would not let Astley win. She would not let him destroy her family, her kingdom, her future. She would fight him, with every ounce of her strength, with every fiber of her being. Sir Hugh, sensing her resolve, placed a hand on her arm, his touch reassuring. We will do this together, Beatrice, he said. We will find the proof we need, and we will bring Astley to justice. His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her strength. She looked at him, at the unwavering loyalty in his eyes, at the quiet strength that emanated from him. And she knew that she was not alone. She had him, her protector, her partner, her friend, and perhaps something more. They returned to the archives, their search now focused on finding the definitive evidence that would expose Astley's treachery. They worked late into the night, poring over documents, deciphering codes, searching for any clue, any hint that might lead them to the truth. They discovered that Astley had been using a network of secret messengers to communicate with his foreign contacts. He had been sending them coded letters carried by trusted couriers who traveled under cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads and checkpoints. Beatrice and Sir Hugh realized that if they could intercept one of these letters, they would have the irrefutable proof they needed. But it would be a dangerous undertaking. Astley's couriers were skilled and ruthless, and they would be heavily guarded. They devised a plan, a daring and risky scheme to ambush one of the couriers and seize the letter. They would need the help of a few trusted allies, people they could rely on to keep their secret and to fight by their side. They approached Lady Eleanor, who readily agreed to help. She had her own network of informants, people who were loyal to her and who despised Astley. She also had access to resources, to horses, to weapons that they would need. They also enlisted the help of a few of Sir Hugh's former comrades in arms, knights who had served with him in the border wars, men of unwavering loyalty and courage. They were men who had seen Astley's true colors and who were eager to see him brought to justice. With their team assembled, they set their plan in motion. They learned the route that one of Astley's couriers was taking, a remote and treacherous path through the forest. They laid in ambush, waiting in the shadows, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. The wait was agonizing, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the hooting of an owl. Beatrice felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She was not a warrior, not a fighter. She was a scholar, a dreamer. But she was also a woman determined to protect her kingdom, her family, her future. She was also a woman falling more deeply, by each passing moment, for the man at her side. And that was the glimmer of trust that she had. The trust that no matter what, they would have each other. Chapter 10. The Tournament of Shadows. The ambush was swift and brutal. Astley's courier, a hardened mercenary, was taken by surprise, but he fought back fiercely. Sir Hugh and his men engaged him in a desperate struggle, swords clashing in the darkness, the air filled with the sounds of grunts and cries of pain. Beatrice, armed with a dagger and a newfound courage, watched from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never witnessed such violence before, and the sight of it filled her with both fear and a strange sense of exhilaration. Sir Hugh, his face grim and determined, fought with the skill and ferocity of a seasoned warrior. He moved with a grace and power that belied his age, his sword a blur of silver in the moonlight. He parried the courier's blows, dodged his attacks, and finally, with a swift and decisive thrust, disarmed him. The courier, wounded and defeated, fell to his knees, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance. Sir Hugh stood over him, his sword pointed at his throat, his expression unyielding. "The letter," Sir Hugh demanded, his voice cold and hard. "Where is it?" The courier hesitated, his gaze flickering towards a small, leather-bound pouch that hung from his belt. Sir Hugh followed his gaze, and with a swift movement, ripped the pouch from his grasp. He opened it, revealing a tightly rolled scroll, sealed with Astley's personal crest. It was the proof they had been searching for, the undeniable evidence of Astley's treachery. Beatrice let out a sigh of relief, her body trembling with the release of tension. They had done it. They had succeeded in their dangerous mission. But their victory was short-lived. As Sir Hugh was securing the courier, a volley of arrows rained down on them from the surrounding trees. They were ambushed again. Astley had anticipated their move. He had set a trap, a counter-ambush, to eliminate them and retrieve the letter. Beatrice cried out in alarm as one of Sir Hugh's men fell to the ground, an arrow protruding from his chest. The others scattered, seeking cover behind the trees, returning fire with their own bows and arrows. Sir Hugh, shielding Beatrice with his body, pushed her towards a thicket of bushes. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice urgent. "Don't move." He drew his sword and rejoined the fight, his movements swift and deadly. He was a whirlwind of steel, cutting down one attacker after another, protecting his men, protecting Beatrice. Beatrice, crouched low to the ground, her heart pounding with fear, watched the battle unfold. She saw Sir Hugh, his face covered in sweat and blood, fighting with a courage and determination that inspired awe. She saw his men, outnumbered but unyielding, fighting by his side, their loyalty unwavering. She also saw the attackers, a group of ruthless mercenaries, hired by Astley to do his dirty work. They were skilled and well-armed, and they were slowly gaining the upper hand. Beatrice knew that she had to do something, anything, to help. She couldn't just sit there, hiding in the bushes, while Sir Hugh and his men risked their lives for her. She saw a discarded bow and a quiver of arrows lying near her. She had never used a bow before, but she had watched Sir Hugh practice, and she had a natural aptitude for accuracy. She picked up the bow, her hands trembling, and nocked an arrow. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired. The arrow flew true, striking one of the attackers in the shoulder. He cried out in pain and stumbled back, giving Sir Hugh an opening to strike. Beatrice fired again, and again, each arrow finding its mark. She was not a warrior, but she was a quick learner, and she was driven by a desperate desire to protect the man she loved. Her actions, though small, had a significant impact. They disrupted the attackers' momentum, gave Sir Hugh and his men a much-needed respite, and helped to turn the tide of the battle. Eventually, the remaining attackers, realizing they were outmatched, retreated into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Sir Hugh, his chest heaving, his body covered in cuts and bruises, surveyed the scene. One of his men was dead, 2 others were wounded, but the rest were alive. They had survived. He turned to Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You saved us, Beatrice," he said, his voice hoarse. You were magnificent. Beatrice, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, could only nod. She had never felt so alive, so empowered, so terrified. They gathered the dead and wounded and made their way back to the castle under cover of darkness. They had the letter, the proof they needed, but they had paid a heavy price. The king was furious when he learned of the ambush. He realized that Astley was even more dangerous than he had imagined, that he was willing to kill to protect his secrets. He ordered Astley's immediate arrest, and he summoned the court to a grand tournament, where he would publicly reveal Astley's treachery and present the evidence against him. The tournament was a spectacle of pomp and pageantry, a display of royal power and authority. Knights from across the kingdom gathered to compete in jousting, sword fighting, and archery. The stands were filled with nobles, courtiers, and common folk, all eager to witness the games and the unfolding drama. It was a tournament of shadows, a public spectacle with the darkest of secrets waiting to emerge. And, as Beatrice stood beside the king, the letter safely hidden in her gown, she knew. Today, everything would change. Chapter 11. Beneath a Cloak of Stars. The tournament was a dazzling display of skill and courage, but Beatrice's mind was elsewhere. She watched the knights jousting, their lances shattering against shields, the thunder of hooves echoing across the field, but her thoughts were consumed by the impending confrontation with Astley. She knew that he would not go down without a fight. He was a master of manipulation, of deceit, and he would use every trick he could to discredit her, to turn the king against her, to escape justice. Sir Hugh, sensing her anxiety, placed a hand on her arm, his touch reassuring. "It will be all right, Beatrice," he said, his voice low and calm. "We have the evidence. The king trusts us. Astley cannot win." His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her a measure of comfort, but she still felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She had seen Astley's ruthlessness, his willingness to kill to protect his secrets. She knew that he was capable of anything. As the day wore on, the tension in the air grew thicker. The crowd, unaware of the underlying drama, cheered and applauded the competing knights, their voices a constant roar. But Beatrice could sense the unease among the courtiers, the whispers and glances, the unspoken questions. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, the king rose from his throne. A hush fell over the crowd. The moment of truth had arrived. "My loyal subjects," the king announced, his voice booming across the arena. "I have gathered you here today not only to celebrate the skills and courage of our noble knights, but also to address a matter of grave importance." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. Beatrice, standing beside him, felt a shiver of anticipation run down her spine. "I have recently uncovered a conspiracy," the king continued, his voice hardening. "A plot to betray me, to betray our kingdom, to overthrow the monarchy." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Accusations of treason were rare, and they always carried the weight of life and death. "The traitor," the king said, his voice ringing with authority, "is none other than Lord Astley." A collective gasp, louder this time, echoed through the arena. Astley, who had been standing near the front, his face a mask of composure, suddenly paled. He knew that his game was up. "I have evidence," the king said, irrefutable proof of Astley's treachery. "Letters, written in his own hand, to our enemies, offering them state secrets, military intelligence, plotting with them to assassinate me and seize the throne." He gestured to Beatrice. "Lady Beatrice of Montwick," he said, "has been instrumental in uncovering this conspiracy. She has risked her life to gather this evidence, to bring this traitor to justice." All eyes turned to Beatrice. She stood tall, her head held high, her expression resolute. She met Astley's gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and pity. Astley, realizing that he was cornered, tried to deny the accusations. He claimed that the letters were forgeries, that Beatrice was lying, that she was motivated by a desire for revenge for her father's execution. But his words rang hollow. The king produced the letter, the one that Beatrice and Sir Hugh had seized from the courier and presented it to the court. The royal scribes confirmed that the handwriting was indeed Astley's, and the seal was his personal crest. Astley's allies, seeing the tide turn against him, began to distance themselves. His lies and manipulations were exposed, his power and influence shattered. He was a broken man, stripped of his titles, his wealth, his honor. The king ordered his arrest, and he was led away, his head bowed in shame, his future sealed. Beatrice felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. Astley had been defeated. Justice had been served. But she also felt a sense of sadness, a sense of loss. She had spent so many years hating Astley, blaming him for her father's downfall, for her own suffering. Now, seeing him defeated and disgraced, she felt no joy, only a hollow emptiness. Sir Hugh, sensing her emotions, took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "You did it, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You avenged your father. You saved the kingdom." She looked at him, at the admiration in his eyes, at the love that she saw shining there. And she knew that she had found something more valuable than revenge, more precious than justice. She had found love. That night, after the celebrations had ended and the castle had fallen silent, Beatrice and Sir Hugh found themselves alone on a balcony, overlooking the moonlit lake. The air was cool and crisp, and the stars were shining brightly, a cloak of diamonds spread across the velvet sky. They stood in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their shoulders touching. The events of the day had left them drained, exhausted, but also filled with a sense of peace, of closure. "It's over," Beatrice said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Astley is gone. My father, he can finally rest in peace." Sir Hugh nodded. "You have cleared his name, Beatrice," he said. "You have restored your family's honor." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Hugh," she said. "You were my strength, my protector, my friend." He smiled, a gentle smile that lit up his face. "And you were mine, Beatrice," he said. "You gave me a purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to hope." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I have grown to care for you deeply, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. She had known, she had felt it, but to hear him say the words, to see the love shining in his eyes, it was overwhelming. "And you, Hugh," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I love you." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. His eyes were filled with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. He leaned and kissed her, beneath the cloak of stars. It was the beginning, and also the end of everything that had kept them apart. Chapter 12. The Price of Freedom. The kiss was a revelation, a release of pent-up emotions, a culmination of months of shared danger, mutual respect, and growing affection. It was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, a hesitant expression of feelings long suppressed. But then it deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, a declaration of love that transcended words, that spoke of a bond forged in fire, a connection that had defied the odds. Beatrice melted into his embrace, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressed against his. She felt a sense of belonging, of safety, of completeness that she had never experienced before. She had spent so many years alone, isolated, a prisoner of her past. Now, in Sir Hugh's arms, she felt free, alive, reborn. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze that spoke volumes. The world around them seemed to fade away, the castle, the court, the kingdom, all disappearing into the background. There was only them, their love, their future, stretching out before them like a vast, uncharted territory. But reality soon intruded. They were not just two lovers, alone in the world. They were a knight and a lady, bound by duty, by responsibility, by the expectations of their society. Their love was a fragile flower, blooming in a harsh and unforgiving landscape. We cannot simply be together, Hugh," Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. "There are obstacles. Complications." Sir Hugh nodded, his expression somber. He knew what she meant. He was a knight, sworn to serve the king. He had no lands, no title, no wealth to offer her. She was a lady of noble birth, the rightful heir to Montwick Castle, a prize to be won, a pawn in the game of political alliances. "The king," Sir Hugh said, his voice low and grave. "He will have plans for you, Beatrice. He will want to reward you for your service, to secure your loyalty. He may arrange a marriage for you, to a powerful noble, to strengthen his own position." The thought of being forced to marry another man, to be separated from Sir Hugh, filled Beatrice with dread. She had tasted freedom, she had found love, and she could not bear the thought of losing it all. "I will not marry anyone but you, Hugh," she said, her voice fierce with determination. "I will defy the king, I will defy the court, I will defy the entire world, if I have to." Sir Hugh smiled, a sad, tender smile that touched her heart. "You are a brave woman, Beatrice," he said. "But we must be realistic. We cannot simply defy the king.
We must be strategic.
We must find a way to be together, without jeopardizing our safety, our future." They discussed their options, weighing the risks and the rewards. They could elope, run away together, seeking refuge in a distant land, far from the reach of the king's power. But that would mean abandoning their families, their homes, their responsibilities. It would mean living in exile, always looking over their shoulders, fearing the king's wrath. They could appeal to the king, plead with him to allow them to marry. But that was a risky proposition. The king was a pragmatic ruler, and he was unlikely to put personal feelings above political considerations. He might see their love as a weakness, a vulnerability, a threat to his own plans. They could try to find allies, influential nobles who might support their cause, who might persuade the king to grant their wish. But that would take time, and it was not guaranteed to succeed. They were caught in a dilemma, a seemingly impossible situation. Their love was strong, but it was not enough. They needed a miracle, a stroke of luck, a twist of fate, to overcome the obstacles that stood in their way. As they were pondering their options, a messenger arrived, bearing a summons from the king. He requested their presence in his private chambers, immediately. Beatrice and Sir Hugh exchanged a look of apprehension. They had no idea what the king wanted, but they knew that it could not be good. They had defied him, they had fallen in love, and they were about to face the consequences. They followed the messenger, their hearts pounding in their chests, their hands clasped tightly together. They were walking into the unknown, facing an uncertain future, their love hanging in the balance. The price of freedom, they were beginning to understand, might be higher than they could ever have imagined. And, as they stepped into the king's chambers, they knew they were to find out just what that would be. Chapter 13. A Dance with Deception. The king's private chambers were even more opulent than the public areas of the castle. Tapestries depicting scenes of royal hunts and battles adorned the walls, and the furniture was crafted from rare and exotic woods. A large fireplace dominated one wall, a roaring fire casting a warm glow over the room. King Edward was seated at a large, ornately carved table, reviewing documents. He looked up as Beatrice and Sir Hugh entered, his expression unreadable. "Lady Beatrice, Sir Hugh," he said, his voice grave. "I have summoned you here to discuss your future." Beatrice and Sir Hugh exchanged a nervous glance. This was it, the moment of truth. "As you know," the king continued, "Lady Beatrice is the rightful heir to Montwick Castle and its surrounding lands. She has also proven herself to be a loyal and valuable subject, instrumental in uncovering Astley's treachery." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "I have given much thought to this matter," he said, "and I have decided that it is in the best interests of the kingdom to reward Lady Beatrice for her service and to secure her loyalty." Beatrice's heart sank. She knew what was coming. The king was going to announce her betrothal to a powerful noble, a man she did not love, a man who would be a political pawn, not a partner. Therefore, the king said, his voice ringing with authority, I have decided to betroth Lady Beatrice to. He paused, his gaze fixed on Sir Hugh. Beatrice held her breath, her body trembling with anticipation and dread. To Sir Hugh of Ravensshire, the king finished. Beatrice and Sir Hugh stared at the king, stunned, speechless. They could not believe what they had just heard. The king was betrothing them to each other? It was a miracle, an impossible dream come true. Your Majesty, Sir Hugh stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. I am honored, but I am not worthy of Lady Beatrice. I have no lands, no title, no wealth to offer her. The king smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his features.
Nonsense, Sir Hugh, he said.
You are a knight of renowned valor, a loyal servant of the crown, a man of impeccable honor. You are more than worthy of Lady Beatrice. He turned to Beatrice, his gaze softening further. And you, Lady Beatrice, he said. You have shown remarkable courage and determination. You have proven yourself to be a strong and capable woman, worthy of your inheritance. He paused, his expression turning serious once more. But this betrothal is not without its conditions, he said. There are certain expectations that I have of both of you. Beatrice and Sir Hugh exchanged a look of apprehension. They had expected this. There was always a price, always a catch. Sir Hugh, the king said, I am appointing you as the new Lord of Montwick. You will be responsible for the castle, its lands, and its people. You will swear an oath of fealty to me, and you will serve me faithfully, as you have always done. Sir Hugh bowed his head. I accept, Your Majesty, he said. I will serve you with all my heart, with all my strength, with all my loyalty. And Lady Beatrice, the king continued, turning to her. You will assist Sir Hugh in his duties. You will use your knowledge of Montwick, your understanding of its people, to help him rule wisely and justly. You will also continue to serve me as my eyes and ears at court. Beatrice understood. The king was not just rewarding them, he was using them. He was placing them in a position of power and responsibility, but he was also making them his agents, his spies, his instruments of control. She hesitated, her mind racing. She loved Sir Hugh, and she wanted to marry him more than anything. But she also valued her independence, her freedom. She did not want to be a pawn, a puppet, controlled by the king. But she also knew that she had no choice. She could not refuse the king's offer. It was a chance to rebuild her life, to restore her family's honor, to be with the man she loved. I accept, Your Majesty, she said, her voice firm, though her heart was filled with a mixture of joy and trepidation. The king nodded, satisfied.
Good, he said.
Then it is settled. The betrothal will be announced tomorrow, and the wedding will take place in 1 month's time. He dismissed them, and they left the king's chambers, their minds reeling. They had achieved their dream, but it had come at a price. They were now bound to the king, their lives intertwined with his, their future dependent on his favor. They walked in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped tightly together. They were both grappling with the implications of the king's decision, with the challenges and responsibilities that lay ahead. They were entering into a dance with deception, a game of power and intrigue, where they would have to be constantly on their guard, constantly watching their backs, constantly navigating the treacherous currents of courtly life. It was a world filled with hidden dangers, with shifting alliances. The betrothal had shifted the dance, placed them center stage. We will be careful, my love, Sir Hugh said. His words brought comfort, but still, Beatrice knew. The game had only just begun. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Truth. The betrothal announcement was met with a mixture of surprise, excitement, and suspicion. The court was abuzz with speculation about the king's motives, about the sudden rise of Sir Hugh, about the future of Montwick. Some saw it as a just reward for Beatrice's service, a recognition of her courage and determination. Others saw it as a shrewd political move by the king, a way to consolidate his power, to secure the loyalty of a strategically important castle. There were whispers and rumors, of course. Some said that Sir Hugh had used his influence over Beatrice to manipulate the king, that he was a social climber, a fortune hunter. Others said that Beatrice had seduced the king, that she was a scheming vixen, using her beauty and her intelligence to advance her own interests. Beatrice and Sir Hugh ignored the gossip, focusing instead on preparing for their wedding and for their new roles as Lord and Lady of Montwick. They had much to learn, much to do. They had to familiarize themselves with the castle, its lands, its people. They had to establish their authority, gain the trust of their tenants and servants, and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Lady Eleanor was a valuable ally, providing them with guidance and support. She knew the intricacies of courtly life, the personalities and motivations of the key players, and she helped them navigate the treacherous waters of political intrigue. She also warned them about the dangers they faced. Astley was gone, but his allies were still out there, plotting and scheming. They would be looking for any opportunity to undermine Beatrice and Sir Hugh, to discredit them, to take revenge. "You must be vigilant," Lady Eleanor cautioned. "Trust no one but each other. Watch your backs. Be prepared for anything." Beatrice and Sir Hugh took her warnings to heart. They were careful about who they trusted, who they confided in. They established a network of loyal informants, people who would keep them informed of any threats, any plots, any whispers of discontent. They also began to delve deeper into the mysteries surrounding Beatrice's father, Lord Edmund. They had cleared his name of treason, but there were still unanswered questions. Why had he been so easily framed? Who had been his true allies? What had been his ultimate goals? They returned to the archives, searching for any clues, any hints that might shed light on the past. They discovered that Lord Edmund had been a complex and enigmatic figure, a man of many secrets. He had been a skilled diplomat, a shrewd negotiator, a loyal servant of the crown, but he had also been a man of ambition, a man who had played a dangerous game of power and intrigue. They found letters, written in code, that suggested Lord Edmund had been involved in a secret society, a group of nobles who were dissatisfied with the king's rule, who were plotting to reform the kingdom, to limit the king's power, to establish a more just and equitable society. It was a dangerous discovery. If the king learned of this, he might see it as further evidence of Lord Edmund's treachery, and he might turn against Beatrice and Sir Hugh. They decided to keep their discovery secret, sharing it only with Lady Eleanor, who they trusted implicitly. She was intrigued by the revelation, and she agreed to help them investigate further. Together, they began to unravel the threads of a conspiracy that was far more complex and far-reaching than they had ever imagined. They discovered that Lord Edmund had not been working alone. He had been part of a larger movement, a network of reformers who were seeking to change the kingdom from within. And they discovered that Astley had not been the mastermind of the plot against Lord Edmund. He had been a tool, a pawn, used by a more powerful, more shadowy figure. The true villain, the person who had orchestrated Lord Edmund's downfall, was someone they had never suspected, someone who had been hiding in plain sight, someone who was still at court, still wielding power and influence. It was a shocking revelation, a twist that neither Beatrice nor Sir Hugh had anticipated. It changed everything. It meant that their quest for justice was far from over. It meant that they were still in danger, that their lives were still on the line. It was the unveiling of the truth, but not the truth. One more layer, one more enemy, and as the wedding loomed, they had to fight one more time. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion. The revelation of the true mastermind behind Lord Edmund's downfall sent shockwaves through Beatrice, Sir Hugh, and Lady Eleanor. It was Lord Ashworth, the king's seemingly loyal and trusted advisor, a man who had been a fixture at court for decades, a man who had always appeared to be a staunch supporter of the monarchy. Ashworth was a master of deception, a cunning and ruthless manipulator who had managed to conceal his true intentions for years. He had used his position of influence to control the flow of information to the king, to manipulate events to his own advantage, to eliminate his enemies, including Lord Edmund. He had been the leader of the secret society, the network of reformers who sought to limit the king's power. But his goals were not noble, not driven by a desire for justice or equality. He sought to overthrow the king, not to reform the kingdom, but to seize the throne for himself, to establish a new dynasty, with himself as the absolute ruler. Astley had been his puppet, his instrument, carrying out his orders, doing his dirty work. But Ashworth was the true architect of the conspiracy, the mastermind behind the plot that had led to Lord Edmund's execution and Beatrice's long imprisonment. Beatrice was devastated by the discovery. She had trusted Ashworth, had respected him, had even sought his advice on occasion. To learn that he was the true villain, the man responsible for her family's suffering, filled her with rage and a burning desire for revenge. Sir Hugh, though equally shocked, was more cautious. He knew that Ashworth was a powerful and dangerous enemy, a man with allies throughout the court, a man who would not hesitate to kill to protect his secrets. "We must be careful, Beatrice," he warned. "We cannot simply confront Ashworth. We need proof, irrefutable evidence that will convince the king, the court, the people, that he is a traitor." Lady Eleanor agreed. "Ashworth is a master of manipulation," she said. "He will deny everything. He will turn the accusations against you. He will use his influence to discredit you, to destroy you." They knew that they were walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one misstep, and they could fall to their deaths. They decided to proceed cautiously, gathering evidence in secret, building a case against Ashworth that would be impossible to refute. They returned to the archives, searching for any documents, any letters, any clues that might link Ashworth to the secret society, to the plot against Lord Edmund. They discovered that Ashworth had been communicating with the king's enemies, with foreign powers who sought to destabilize the realm. He had been promising them support, promising them the throne, in exchange for their assistance in overthrowing the king. They also found evidence that Ashworth had been planning to assassinate the king, to stage a coup, to seize power during the upcoming wedding celebrations. He had been using the chaos and confusion of the event to conceal his plot, to position his allies, to prepare for his attack. The wedding, which had been a symbol of hope, of a new beginning for Beatrice and Sir Hugh, was now a trap, a potential bloodbath. They had to act quickly, to expose Ashworth's treachery, to prevent the assassination, to save the king, to save the kingdom. They decided to reveal their findings to the king, but they knew that they had to do it carefully, strategically. They could not simply confront him with the evidence. Ashworth was his trusted advisor, and the king might not believe them. He might see it as a plot by Beatrice and Sir Hugh to seize power for themselves. They devised a plan, a daring and risky scheme to expose Ashworth's treachery during the wedding ceremony itself. They would use the moment of maximum public exposure, the moment when all eyes were on the king, to reveal the truth, to present the evidence, to unmask the traitor. It was a dangerous gamble, a desperate attempt to save everything they held dear. It could succeed, exposing Ashworth and saving the kingdom. Or it could fail, leading to their own deaths, to the collapse of the monarchy, to the triumph of a ruthless tyrant. Flames of rebellion were licking at the edges of the kingdom. Ashworth had set them, but Beatrice and Sir Hugh intended to quench them, even if it meant getting burnt themselves. Chapter 16. The Lion's Denver. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of conspiracy that hung over the kingdom. The castle was a hive of activity, bustling with preparations for the ceremony and the subsequent feast. Guests arrived from across the land, nobles and knights, ladies and dignitaries, all eager to witness the union of Lady Beatrice of Montwick and Sir Hugh of Ravensshire. Beatrice, dressed in a gown of white silk embroidered with silver thread, felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was the day she had dreamed of, the day she would marry the man she loved, the day she would begin a new life. But it was also the day of reckoning, the day they would confront Ashworth, the day they would risk everything to save the kingdom. Sir Hugh, resplendent in his knightly armor, his face grim and determined, stood by her side, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. They had rehearsed their plan countless times, going over every detail, anticipating every possible contingency. They knew the risks, the dangers, but they were prepared to face them, together. The ceremony took place in the castle chapel, a magnificent space filled with stained glass windows and soaring arches. The king himself presided over the ceremony, his presence lending an air of solemnity and authority. As Beatrice and Sir Hugh exchanged their vows, their voices clear and strong, she felt a surge of love and hope. Despite the danger that loomed, despite the uncertainty of the future, she knew that she was doing the right thing, that she was marrying the man she was meant to be with, that they would face whatever came their way, together. But as the ceremony neared its conclusion, Beatrice knew that the time had come to act. She glanced at Sir Hugh, who nodded imperceptibly, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. As the king was about to pronounce them husband and wife, Beatrice stepped forward, her voice ringing out through the chapel, clear and strong. "Your Majesty," she said, "before we conclude this sacred ceremony, there is a matter of grave importance that must be addressed." A hush fell over the assembled guests. All eyes turned to Beatrice, their expressions a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The king, his brow furrowed in confusion, looked at Beatrice with a questioning gaze. "What is it, Lady Beatrice?" he asked. "Your Majesty," Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with conviction, "there is a traitor in our midst. A man who has betrayed your trust, who has plotted against you, who seeks to overthrow your rule." A gasp rippled through the chapel. Accusations of treason, especially on a wedding day, were unheard of. "And who is this traitor, Lady Beatrice?" the king asked, his voice hardening, his eyes narrowing. Beatrice took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. She looked directly at Lord Ashworth, who was standing near the front, his face a mask of composure, but his eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "It is Lord Ashworth, Your Majesty," Beatrice said, her voice ringing with authority. A collective gasp, louder this time, echoed through the chapel. Ashworth, his composure shattered, stepped forward, his face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous," he exclaimed. "This woman is lying. She is trying to discredit me, to turn you against me, Your Majesty." "I have proof, Your Majesty," Beatrice said, ignoring Ashworth's outburst. She produced the documents they had found in the archives, the letters, the coded messages, the evidence of Ashworth's communication with the king's enemies. Sir Hugh stepped forward, supporting Beatrice's accusations. He presented the evidence of Ashworth's plan to assassinate the king during the wedding celebrations, the details of the plot, the names of the conspirators. The king, his face pale with shock and disbelief, listened to their accusations, his eyes darting between Beatrice, Sir Hugh, and Ashworth. He examined the evidence, his hands trembling slightly. Ashworth, realizing that he was cornered, tried to deny everything, to claim that the documents were forgeries, that Beatrice and Sir Hugh were the real traitors, that they were plotting to seize power for themselves. But his words rang hollow. The evidence was overwhelming, the proof irrefutable. His allies, seeing the tide turn against him, began to distance themselves. He was a lone wolf, a cornered beast. They were stepping into a lion's den. And Ashworth was the lion. The king, the courtroom, and a wedding, all colliding to create the perfect storm, and Beatrice and Sir Hugh were in the center. Chapter 17. A bond forged in fire. The king, his face a mask of fury, turned to Ashworth, his voice trembling with rage. "Is this true, Ashworth?" he demanded. "Have you betrayed me? Have you plotted against my life?" Ashworth, realizing that his game was up, that he could no longer maintain his facade of innocence, finally cracked. His composure shattered, his arrogance vanished, replaced by a mixture of fear and desperation. "Yes, Your Majesty," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "It is true. I plotted against you. I sought to overthrow you. I wanted the throne for myself." A collective gasp of horror and disbelief echoed through the chapel. The guests, who had come to celebrate a wedding, were now witnessing a confession of treason, a scene of betrayal and shattered trust. The king, his voice filled with a mixture of grief and fury, ordered Ashworth's immediate arrest. The royal guards, who had been standing silently throughout the proceedings, stepped forward and seized Ashworth, dragging him away, his protests and pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. The king then turned to Beatrice and Sir Hugh, his expression softening, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You have saved my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You have saved the kingdom. You have proven yourselves to be true and loyal subjects." He embraced them both, thanking them for their courage, their determination, their unwavering loyalty. The guests, realizing the magnitude of what had just transpired, erupted in applause, cheering for Beatrice and Sir Hugh, praising their bravery, their heroism. The wedding ceremony, which had been interrupted by the dramatic confrontation, was now resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was filled with a sense of relief, of gratitude, of renewed hope. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, their hands clasped tightly together, exchanged their vows once more, their voices filled with a newfound depth of emotion, a profound understanding of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond that had been tested by fire, a bond that had emerged stronger, more resilient, more enduring. As the king pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer erupted from the assembled guests, a joyous celebration of love, of loyalty, of triumph over adversity. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, their hearts overflowing with happiness, embraced, their kiss sealing their union, their commitment to each other, their dedication to the kingdom. The subsequent feast was a celebration of victory, a testament to the power of truth, the triumph of justice, the enduring strength of love. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, now Lord and Lady of Montwick, were the center of attention, the heroes of the hour, the saviors of the kingdom. But amidst the celebrations, they did not forget the dangers that still lurked, the enemies that still plotted, the challenges that still lay ahead. Ashworth was gone, but his conspiracy might have deeper roots. His allies might still be out there, seeking revenge. They knew that their lives would never be the same, that they would always be targets, that they would always have to be vigilant, to be prepared for anything. But they also knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, that they had the support of the king, the loyalty of their friends, the love of their people. As they danced together, under the starry sky, the music swirling around them, the laughter and cheers of the guests filling the air, Beatrice and Sir Hugh felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of profound gratitude. They had faced their fears, they had overcome their challenges, they had emerged victorious. Their bond, forged in the crucible of danger, tested by the fires of betrayal, had become unbreakable, a testament to the enduring power of love, a beacon of hope in a world of darkness. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the heart of a storm, in the midst of a battle, in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a bond forged not just in fire, but through it, and as such, would never be broken. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, now officially Lord and Lady of Montwick, returned to the castle that had been both Beatrice's prison and her birthright. They were greeted with cheers and celebrations by the castle staff and the local villagers, who were relieved and grateful for their return, for the justice that had been served, for the hope of a brighter future. But amidst the celebrations, Beatrice and Sir Hugh knew that they had much work to do. Montwick had been neglected for years, its resources depleted by Astley's greed and corruption. The castle itself was in need of repair, the lands needed to be properly managed, and the people needed to be reassured that their new lord and lady were committed to their well-being. They set about their tasks with diligence and determination, working side by side, sharing the responsibilities of leadership, drawing on each other's strengths, supporting each other's weaknesses. Beatrice, with her knowledge of the castle, its history, and its people, took charge of the internal affairs, overseeing the household staff, managing the finances, and addressing the needs of the tenants and villagers. Sir Hugh, with his military experience and his innate sense of justice, focused on the external affairs, repairing the castle defenses, training the guards, establishing a system of law and order, and ensuring the safety and security of the surrounding lands. They made a formidable team, their skills and personalities complementing each other perfectly. Beatrice's compassion and empathy tempered Sir Hugh's sometimes stern and authoritarian approach, while his strength and decisiveness gave her the confidence and support she needed to overcome her own insecurities and doubts. They also made time for each other, for their love, for their new life together. They explored the castle and its surrounding lands, discovering hidden corners, secret gardens, ancient ruins. They shared quiet moments together, reading by the fire, walking in the gardens, simply enjoying each other's company. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of danger and betrayal, deepened and matured, blossoming into a love that was both passionate and profound, a bond that was both strong and tender. They learned to trust each other implicitly, to rely on each other completely, to support each other unconditionally. But amidst their happiness, there were still moments of doubt, of fear, of uncertainty. The shadow of Ashworth's conspiracy still lingered, and they knew that there might be other enemies out there, plotting and scheming. They had to remain vigilant, to be constantly on their guard, to protect themselves and their people. One evening, as they were sitting together in their private chambers, sharing a quiet meal, Beatrice confessed her fears to Sir Hugh. "I worry, Hugh," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I worry that we will never be truly safe, that there will always be someone out there who wants to harm us, to take away what we have." Sir Hugh took her hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "We will face whatever comes, Beatrice," he said, his voice firm and calm. "Together. We are stronger together than we are apart. We have each other, and we have the loyalty of our people. That is all we need." His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her comfort, but she still felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She had lived with fear for so long. It was hard to let it go, hard to believe that she could truly be safe, truly be happy. Sir Hugh, sensing her unease, drew her closer, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. "I love you, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I will always protect you. I will always keep you safe. That is my vow, my promise, my sacred duty." Beatrice melted into his embrace, her body trembling with the intensity of her emotions. She felt his love surrounding her, protecting her, healing her. She knew that she was not alone, that she had him, her husband, her protector, her soulmate. "And I love you, Hugh," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "With all my heart, with all my soul, with all my being." They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their love. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of healing, of a future filled with promise. It was, at last, the heart's reckoning, the full realization, the full release of all the fears, and the acceptance, fully, of a love that had defied the odds. The fears would always be there, lurking. But now, they would be faced together. Chapter 19. Shadows of Montwick. Years passed, and Montwick flourished under the rule of Beatrice and Sir Hugh. The castle was restored to its former glory, its walls repaired, its gardens replanted, its halls filled with laughter and music once more. The surrounding lands prospered, the fields yielding abundant harvests, the villagers thriving under their just and compassionate leadership. Beatrice and Sir Hugh proved to be a formidable team, their skills and personalities complementing each other perfectly. Beatrice's wisdom and empathy tempered Sir Hugh's sometimes stern and authoritarian approach, while his strength and decisiveness gave her the confidence and support she needed to overcome her own insecurities and doubts. They had children, a son and a daughter, who brought them immeasurable joy and filled their lives with purpose. They raised them with love and discipline, teaching them the values of honesty, integrity, courage, and compassion. But even amidst their happiness, the shadows of the past continued to linger. The memory of Beatrice's father, Lord Edmund, and his tragic fate, the betrayal of Ashworth, the years of imprisonment and isolation, these were wounds that time could not fully heal. And there were new challenges, new threats, new enemies. The kingdom was never truly at peace. There were border skirmishes, rebellions, conspiracies, and intrigues. Sir Hugh, as Lord of Montwick, was often called upon to serve the king, to lead his troops into battle, to defend the realm against its enemies. Beatrice, while she supported her husband's duty to the king, always feared for his safety. She knew the dangers of war, the risks he faced, the possibility that he might not return. Every time he rode off to battle, she felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach, a fear that she could not shake. She found solace in her children, in her work at the castle, in her friendships with the local villagers. She became a patron of the arts, supporting local craftsmen and artists, encouraging the development of music, literature, and painting. She established a school for the children of the village, ensuring that they received an education, that they had opportunities that she had been denied. She also continued to delve into the history of Montwick, searching for answers to the lingering questions about her father's past, about the secret society he had been involved in, about the true extent of Ashworth's conspiracy. She discovered that Lord Edmund had been a complex and enigmatic figure, a man of many contradictions. He had been a loyal servant of the crown, but he had also been a reformer, a man who believed in justice, in equality, in limiting the power of the monarchy. She found evidence that the secret society he had been involved in was not a treasonous organization, as Ashworth had claimed, but a group of nobles and scholars who were seeking to improve the kingdom, to make it a more just and equitable place for all its citizens. She realized that her father had been a man of vision, a man ahead of his time, a man who had been betrayed and murdered for his beliefs. She was proud of him, proud of his courage, proud of his commitment to justice. But she also knew that his legacy was a dangerous one, that there were still those who saw him as a traitor, who would seek to discredit his memory, to undermine the work that she and Sir Hugh were doing at Montwick. One day, a mysterious visitor arrived at the castle, a man claiming to be a scholar, interested in the history of Montwick. He was polite and respectful, but Beatrice sensed something unsettling about him, something that made her uneasy. She allowed him access to the castle archives, but she kept a close eye on him, monitoring his activities, watching for any sign of deception. Her instincts were correct. The man was not a scholar, but a spy, sent by a rival noble who sought to claim Montwick for himself. He was searching for evidence that could be used to discredit Beatrice and Sir Hugh, to portray them as traitors, to undermine their authority, to pave the way for an invasion. Beatrice, with the help of Sir Hugh and their loyal retainers, exposed the spy and thwarted his plans. But the incident served as a reminder of the dangers they faced, of the constant threats that lurked in the shadows. The shadows of Montwick had always been there, and while the years had passed, they were not entirely gone. They would always linger, a reminder of the battles fought. Chapter 20. The Dawn of Redemption. The spy's unmasking served as a stark reminder that despite the years of peace and prosperity, vigilance was ever necessary. Montwick, while a beacon of their love and leadership, was also a strategic stronghold and thus a target. Beatrice and Sir Hugh redoubled their efforts to ensure the castle's security, not just for themselves and their children, but for all who lived under their protection. However, the incident also sparked a renewed determination in Beatrice to finally lay to rest the ghosts of her father's past. She realized that true peace for Montwick, and for her own heart, required a complete reckoning with the truth, no matter how painful. With Sir Hugh's support, she initiated a formal inquiry, inviting scholars and historians from across the kingdom to examine the evidence she had gathered over the years. She presented the letters, the coded messages, the testimonies of those who had known her father, all meticulously documented and preserved. She wanted a public, official declaration of Lord Edmund's true intentions, a clearing of his name that went beyond the king's initial pardon. The inquiry was a long and arduous process, filled with debates and discussions, challenges and counter-arguments. Some still clung to the old accusations, fueled by lingering suspicions and political rivalries. But Beatrice, armed with her unwavering belief in her father's integrity and the irrefutable evidence she had amassed, persevered. Sir Hugh stood by her side throughout, his presence a constant source of strength and support. He used his influence and reputation to ensure that the inquiry was conducted fairly and impartially, protecting Beatrice from those who sought to discredit her or silence her. Finally, after months of deliberation, the inquiry reached its conclusion. The scholars and historians, having meticulously examined all the evidence, issued their verdict. Lord Edmund of Montwick had not been a traitor. He had been a loyal servant of the crown, a reformer who sought to improve the kingdom through peaceful means, a man who had been unjustly accused and murdered for his beliefs. It was a moment of profound vindication for Beatrice, a triumph of truth over lies, of justice over betrayal. Tears streamed down her face as the verdict was announced, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering sorrow for the father she had lost too soon. The king, who had initially been hesitant about reopening the wounds of the past, now publicly acknowledged Lord Edmund's innocence, praising his vision and his commitment to justice. He issued a formal decree, restoring Lord Edmund's honor and recognizing his contributions to the kingdom. It was a dawn of redemption, not just for Lord Edmund, but for Montwick itself. The shadows of the past, which had lingered for so long, were finally dispelled, replaced by the light of truth and reconciliation. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, standing together in the castle courtyard, surrounded by their children, their friends, and the loyal people of Montwick, felt a sense of peace, of completion, of profound gratitude. They had faced their challenges, overcome their obstacles, and emerged victorious. Their love, forged in the crucible of danger and betrayal, had endured, growing stronger and deeper with each passing year. They had built a life together, a family, a legacy of justice and compassion. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the castle walls, Beatrice and Sir Hugh embraced, their hearts filled with love and hope. They knew that the future would hold new challenges, new threats, but they also knew that they would face them together, with courage, with determination, with unwavering faith in each other and in the power of truth. The dawn had broken, and, finally, all was at peace.
Epilogue.
The tapestry of years continued to weave its intricate patterns across Montwick. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, watched their children grow and flourish. Their son, Edmund, named for his grandfather, inherited his father's strength and his mother's compassion, becoming a skilled knight and a wise leader. Their daughter, Annalise, named for Beatrice's mother, possessed her mother's intelligence and her father's unwavering sense of justice, becoming a scholar and a diplomat, renowned for her wisdom and her eloquence. Montwick itself continued to thrive, a beacon of peace and prosperity in a turbulent world. The castle, once a symbol of isolation and despair, became a center of learning and culture, a refuge for those seeking justice and compassion. The surrounding lands flourished, the fields yielding abundant harvests, the villagers living in harmony and contentment. Beatrice and Sir Hugh, though they gradually relinquished their day-to-day responsibilities to their children, remained active and engaged in the life of the castle and the kingdom. They served as advisors to their son and daughter, sharing their wisdom and experience, guiding them through the challenges of leadership. They also continued to pursue their own passions. Beatrice devoted herself to the castle archives, preserving the history of Montwick, documenting the lives and legacies of those who had come before. Sir Hugh, though his days of fighting were behind him, continued to train young knights, instilling in them the values of honor, courage, and loyalty. They often walked together in the castle gardens, hand in hand, their love for each other as strong and vibrant as it had been on their wedding day. They reminisced about their past, about the challenges they had faced, the battles they had won, the love that had sustained them through it all. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the moonlit lake, the same lake that had reflected the stars on the night of their betrothal, Beatrice turned to Sir Hugh, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and gratitude. "We have had a good life, Hugh," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "A life filled with love, with purpose, with meaning." Sir Hugh nodded, his own eyes reflecting the same emotions. "We have, Beatrice," he said. "We have built a legacy together, a legacy of justice, of compassion, of hope. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines that time had etched on her cheeks. "And I have loved you," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "every day of our life together. Every moment. Every breath." Beatrice smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And I you, Hugh," she said, "with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my being." They kissed, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had overcome every obstacle, a love that would last for eternity. The shadows were gone. The battles were won. The love remained. And as the moon bathed them in its silvery light, they knew that their story, the story of the trader's daughter and the knight who had loved her, would be told and retold, a legend whispered through the halls of Montwick, a testament to the enduring power of love, of loyalty, of redemption. The ending was written not in ink, but in the lives they had lived, the battles they had fought, and, most importantly, the love they had shared. And it was truly good.